Do you fear the future? A lot of people are uneasy about it, myself included. Not totally, but in one way or another. Rebecca Costa, who's an international best-selling author and a sociobiologist, does not fear the future, though. She embraces it, and she encourages people to prepare for it through a process called pre-adaptation. There's a lot more to the story, though, and we discuss it on this episode of Cato Gottfried. I'm your co-host, Joseph Ford Cato, and my co-host is Paul Gottfried. Rebecca, I think there's no question that most people, in one way or another, are nervous about what the future holds for different reasons. I mean, I think it's hard to generalize here, but you, obviously, in your writing, you embrace the future. And I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you try to communicate to people that the best way of dealing with it isn't by trying to deny what's coming or rationalizing things, but by making themselves as utilitarian as possible for what's coming down the pike. And that gets into the concept of pre-adaptation, but I really don't want to jump the gun with that. We'll talk about it in a minute. But how do you think that the future, I guess, considering all that's taken place over the last 20 years, how, I guess, futuristic the last 2 decades have been in relation to what came before it, how do you think the future will primarily impact, say, the average American maybe over the next 5 or so years?
Well, life as we know it is in a constant flux, and the velocity at which change is coming at us is increasing. So I think it's safe to say that most human beings feel a bit overwhelmed these days. We're overwhelmed by the fact that we can't advise our kids on what college major might have a job waiting for them because many jobs will not exist by the time they get out of college. Information, they say that every 73 days, medical information is doubling. So it calls into question, whether a medical degree is worth anything by the time you graduate. All methodologies and information is pretty much changed. And so in businesses, in our family life, in our day-to-day life, we no longer seem to have a firm grasp of what life will be like 10, 15, 20 years out. And that's a new condition for society. It used to be when I was a young girl, I planned to go to college, get a job, own a home, have a family. And now that model is completely sort of broken down because we can no longer we're no longer in a position where we can anticipate what the future is going to be, or so we think. The fact is machines can anticipate what is going to happen, even if humans cannot. And this is why we need to rely more and more on predictive analytic models to get a grasp of what is coming toward us. In other words, the future is known. It's just not known by you and me. It's known by these very, very powerful predictive analytic models that can assemble billions and billions of factors and look for patterns. And once you know what the first 1,000 numbers are, it's very easy to know what 1,001 is. Imagine now billions and billions of data points assembled together in order to accurately predict what is going to happen in the future. And we see these machine models beginning to creep into, very slowly, into our everyday life in subtle ways. For example, we can do genetic testing for diseases that we may not have contracted yet, but we have a very, very high likelihood of contracting. And then through genetic treatments and therapies, we can head those things off. I can even give you a funny example of using data models to prevent negative outcomes. And that is many times I tell my friends I can predict with about an 85 to 90% accuracy if they're going to trip and fall in the next 3 weeks. And they say that's impossible. And I said, well, no, because these predictive models now have discovered that your normal walking gait will change by 3 to 5 centimeters within a 3-week period of time before you take a fall. And we didn't know until very recently that that was the precursor to taking a fall in the vast majority of cases. So you can imagine what having that kind of information has done in terms of being able to perhaps build a Fitbit-like device to put on the ankle of an elderly person and then ping their phone that their walking gait has changed and they need to get into physical therapy to fix that walking gait to avoid a fall, which in most cases causes a person an elderly person no longer to be able to live independently. They have to go into assisted living, and it's sort of the beginning of a downhill slide. So in that way, machines are now allowing us to have glimpses of the future that we never had before. Even if our brains can't process that kind of data, we can rely on powerful computing systems to do it for us.
I'll ask Paul, I guess, for his 2 cents in a minute, but I just want to throw my opinion out there. It seems that machines, they themselves are growing so intelligent that at some point their intelligence will surpass that of human beings. Now, I've had this debate with quite a few people over the years, and they've often told me, no, it's impossible. A human being will always be able to master a machine, essentially because the human beings create the machines and program them. But I think if one were to create a sort of self-programming machine or a supercomputer, then it could theoretically wind up programming itself in time. And one day relatively soon, we might live in a scenario where machines are more intelligent than not only the average human being, but even the most brilliant of humans. And that would be rather scary, because then machines might see us as irrelevant anachronisms. And obviously there would be too many things to mention here which will come about as a consequence, but the possibility to me definitely seems on the horizon. What do you think about that idea, Rebecca?
Well, they're already smarter than us. This isn't something that's going to happen in the future. Anybody who has an Alexa sitting in their living room knows that it's far more competent than the average human being. So I guess I don't really know what you're talking about, because it's already happened.
I personally, I guess I hadn't thought of how you could, at least right now, compare a human IQ to whatever the machine's equivalent of the IQ is. I would have assumed that the Alexa wasn't as intelligent as a human because it's programmed in a certain way and it can do X, Y, and Z, but not necessarily the full spectrum of cognition that a human can. But if it actually is already more intelligent than a human being, maybe what I feared with machines taking us over one day is a bit closer than I had imagined, which is not a comforting thought, but obviously
Well, it's not going to be like a science fiction movie where the machines decide that humans are expendable and they turn against us and there's a big man-machine war. I mean, it doesn't really work that way. There are issues with artificial intelligence. People, I don't even know if we can call it artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence is us. The intelligence is the machines. And machines are in some ways, they have the same biases that humans have. We'd like to think they're bias-free, but they draw upon the same databases that human beings frequently draw upon. It's better for me, rather than speaking in general terms, is to give a specific example. So let me go to something that has a lot of moral and ethical consequences, and that is the increasing use by judges on algorithms, AI-based algorithms, to determine arraignment sentences, whether to allow somebody to walk free because they're not really a danger, or keep them in prison until their trial can be set. People do not know this, and it freaks them out when I tell them that judges are increasingly relying on AI algorithms to help guide what they do in arraignments. And the reason for that is because the judges believe that they are in some ways biased, as was reflected not long ago when a young man came before a judge over a rape charge, and the judge gave him a very, very light sentence and claimed that it was because the boy was from a good family. I think you probably remember that hitting the headlines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those kinds of biases are inherent in human beings. As Ed Wilson once said, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. But let's not forget those, prehistoric emotions that drive many decisions, even for judges. But there's a sense that if we rely on AI-based algorithms, we'll get more fair and uniform outcomes in sentencing in the judicial system. However, remember that those AI algorithms are drawing from databases. So if, let's say, a person of color is more likely to wind up in jail or reoffend, the AI algorithm is going to have automatically a bias against a person of color. That'll get factored in. If people with low education or low vocabulary are more likely to be imprisoned for longer sentences, that bias will factor in. It will carry forward. So we can't AI is very complicated. We can't just rely on AI to look at all the available data, because the available data itself is biased and not in a healthy way. And so when we use AI algorithms, we now have to necessarily program against the biases of the existing data.
Paul?
Yeah, what I wanted to, let me take these off. What I wanted to point out is that the idea of somehow machines taking over the world and controlling us was sort of a popular cinematic theme. If you remember the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and some of these other movies that were made in the 1980s, 1990s, always depict machines as the enemies, and they somehow are able to reach a level of cognition might say of willfulness, where they just take over human beings and run. It's highly unlikely anything like that could ever happen. For reasons that Rebecca, I think, has pointed out. I mean, you could have machines that are not properly programmed, or which give you data that you don't want, or which require new programming or something like that. But the idea of machines somehow taking us over, controlling us, conquering us, whatever you get in these science fiction movies, at least to me, seems highly unlikely.
I don't think that there's any danger that machines will take us over. I think that the interdependency between humans, biological organisms, and machines has already occurred. We see people now, who have lost their appendages in war, being able to operate, artificial limbs, just through willfulness, just through their neurological pathways. So this melding that Kurzweil talks about,
I'm not hearing anything.
Man and machine has already occurred, and from that standpoint, I think we're better off for it. One thing I do want to point out is whenever there is progress, there's fear, and it's appropriate fear, because there is always a downside to any progress, any human progress. And the example I like to use is when Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic. People forget that he was the recipient of many, many peace prizes because it was thought that if we could shuttle heads of state from one country to another, that war would be less likely, because there would be human beings meeting with other human beings. And so we might avert future conflict. But no one was thinking at the time that we would be using those planes to fly across oceans with bombs. And the same point can be made about the internet. I mean, the internet, for all of its distance learning and distance medicine and all of the wonderful things that came with the internet, if we didn't have the internet, we wouldn't be having cyber warfare and attacks. We wouldn't be worried about privacy and identity theft and all the negatives that came with the internet. So there's no such thing, and this is really important for people to grasp, there is no such thing as progress without a dark side. And as the man-machine meld becomes more complete, there will be abuses, and there will be things to be fearful of. The key is to get out ahead of those. In the past, we act like all progress is really wonderful and we're delusional about it. And then when the bad stuff happens, we go, we weren't prepared for that. We didn't have laws. We weren't expecting it. I think in this particular case, we need to, and particularly where AI is concerned, we can't afford that luxury. We have to get out ahead of artificial intelligence and machine learning and understand what the dangers are and then guard against those dangers proactively.
Essentially, I think that people, when it comes to technology, as you said, they have they're very welcoming toward it at a certain time when the benefits are apparent, when they see clearly that it will do something good for their lives. But then when they ignore the drawbacks, and they ignore the drawbacks because it's not emotionally pleasing to focus on them when you're thinking about all the good things you're getting out of this change. But when the drawbacks do come to pass, people tend to get kind of fanatical, crazy. Oh, we never should have had this change. Look at the problems. This is awful. We need to stop it. No more change, blah, blah, blah. And there's a sort of duality here that I think is very unfortunate, but it's very real all the same. And I just think that people need to understand, as you said, that there's good with bad. And if they don't focus on the good and the bad at the inception of the change, they're going to be in for a rude awakening down the road. But even if they choose to just focus on the good because it's more convenient for them at the time, still, when something goes wrong, they should at least be glad that some things went well. And it's really just about people understanding the balance in play here. And it's unfortunate that more people don't do that, but I think it's part of human nature.
I think that, there's a certain naivete about progress in general. We are a novelty-seeking organism. We were designed by nature, and some would say God, to seek out novelty, newness. And so we're rather fast adapters. You'll find that you might want a super large screen TV for a really long time. You want it. And then finally one day you go and you buy it and you can't wait to install it in your house. And every time you walk by it, you just love it. You're so glad you got it. You can't wait to show it to your friends. And then every day, from the moment that you bought that television, every day, a little by little by little, it wears off. The happiness that it gives you, the excitement that you felt begins to wear off. That's called hedonic adaptation. And it is one of the reasons we make such good consumers, because we have to keep refreshing. This is the legacy of humanity. And because we tire so quickly over positive experiences, we adapt way more quickly to positive experiences than negative experiences. We get on what's called a hedonic treadmill, where we have to get the next one and get the next one and get the next one and get the next one. And that has largely been the reason for the rise of humankind to the top of the living pyramid. But it comes with a price. Because as you start to produce more and more, and there are more human beings, there are more ideas, there's more data, there's more information, there are more ways to get things done, you can kind of get overloaded with a dilemma of overchoice and become completely overwhelmed by what's happening. So remember that, modern man's only been around for a little over 3 million years. It isn't that hard to overwhelm us when we only have about a 3% difference in genetic makeup from a bonobo monkey. It's not that hard to overwhelm us. It is also not that hard for people to take whatever progress we've made and use it for nefarious purposes. And so I would suggest to everybody that, that progress in and of itself is part of being a human being. It's part of humanity. It's part of our legacy. It's the reason we've climbed to the top of the living pyramid. It's not going away. It's in our DNA. And will it be abused and used inappropriately? 110%. You can't, even a hammer can be used as a weapon. Wasn't designed as a weapon, but it can be used as a weapon. And if there's a way it can be used inappropriately, we will find it.
Paul?
No, I've just been listening to this. I'm wondering if Rebecca can offer some kind of proposal as to what we should do in order to prevent, one might say, the negative effects of technological development from overwhelming us, so that we really can derive the benefit without becoming sick of the technology, without wishing to go back to the Stone Age or something like that. Is there some practical advice that you would give in terms of how we can approach technological change?
Yes, one of the great assets that we developed over the 3 million years as we were climbing to the top of that pyramid was the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain. It represents about a third of our brain that allows us to do thought experiments about the future, to think about things that have not yet occurred, and then to calculate risk and make rational decisions about events that have yet to have manifest. Now, no other creature walking the planet, and perhaps maybe even in outer space, has developed this ability to do thought experiments about outcomes. And so we're able to do that. We're able to just think about this. We're able to very precisely imagine what is likely to happen and then do something in the present to either mitigate a danger, eliminate a danger, at the very least, make it smaller, or get the jump on an opportunity that hasn't yet occurred. And when you stop and really think about that, it gives us such a tremendous advantage, not just from a survival standpoint, but from the standpoint of being able to eliminate negative outcomes before they ever happen. And you see this happening right now in the mass shootings. I argued 5 and 6 and 7 years ago that we already had the data in the public domain to see who was a dangerous perpetrator, dangerous to society. That people were signaling on social media what their intentions were, and they were signaling in terms of buying weapons and amassing firepower, and they were signaling in terms of their relationships or lack of relationships, how many times they moved, how many times they quit their jobs, the vocabulary they were using. They were signaling in advance that they were reaching criticality and that we had the ability to stop these dangers to society. But more and more people were saying to me, well, you're advocating a world like Minority Report, that movie with Tom Cruise, where they had the precog police come in and stop a perpetrator 2 seconds before he was going to commit a murder or burglary or some odd thing. And the person would be sentenced strictly on the probability. I don't think we want to arrest people before they do things, but the alternative is that our entire judicial system is oriented toward catching you after the fact. And when after the fact, it means people opening fire in a concert hall and killing dozens and dozens of people, maybe we want to use the data we have, and maybe we want to use that frontal cortex, which took 3 million years to develop, to look ahead and prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening rather than respond to them after the fact.
Moving on to something I think a bit more positive, not to say more important, because that's tremendously important what you had mentioned, but talking about On the Verge and what inspired you to write the book. I'm sure there were many different things. It wasn't just one. But was there maybe, I guess, something that you learned, Rebecca, or something that you saw in society, or something that made you think that this book is really something else, or the idea of it is really something else? And I think it would make for something beneficial for the public, because I've not found another book like On the Verge. It's tremendously interesting, to say the least. Mm-hmm. And I'm just interested in seeing how you came about with the idea of it.
Well, to begin with, I was an evolutionary biologist who landed in Silicon Valley in my career. And as I saw technology increasingly changing and the velocity of change increasing, I wondered if human beings were going to have the ability to adapt fast enough. And the longest living model that we have concerning fast adaptation is really Mother Nature herself. And so I began looking at sudden changes in the physical environment, in the natural environment, and how and why certain creatures survived. And then I began to look at what techniques they used and what rules there were for being able to adapt and be a survivor. And that led to my book On the Verge. I wanted to be able to encapsulate some of the fundamental rules that allow us to survive high failure rate environments, complex high failure rate environments where change is occurring really fast. And as an example, I'll give you one of the rules is any drive toward singularity is a drive toward extinction. So you might wonder why there's millions of types of fish in the ocean and millions of varieties of insects, thousands of types of ants. Why isn't there just one fish and one type of ant? And the reason is because when you have diversification like that, when the environment changes, some of the ants will have what's required to survive and some won't, and some will die off. So in a complex environment, like let's say Wall Street and the financial community, you want diversity. You want diversity because when the market changes, maybe bonds go down, but stocks go up. And maybe real estate goes down, but bonds go up. So we're used to this principle of, in a high failure rate environment, you want as much diversification as you possibly can have as a hedge against change. And that's one of the fundamental rules in nature also. But it also is one of the basic rules for surviving fast changing environments. And so what I've done in this book is basically taken some of these rules that we can learn from nature and applied them to our day-to-day lives.
Paul?
Now that you've written a successful book, is there anything that you would change if you set out to write some kind of sequel to the book with which you have done so smashingly well?
Well, I was asked, I recently spoke, not recently, I guess about 6 months ago, I spoke at a university campus, and I was haunted by one student there that got up and asked me a completely unexpected question. He was an athlete there. He was a straight A student. He was an athlete that had won many, many awards and was there on an athletic scholarship. He was the president of his fraternity. And he sort of told me all of this. And he said, but I was wondering if you had any information about happiness, because I've done all these things and I've strived really hard, but I don't think I'm very happy. And I was very taken aback by this. And I thought, do we have any predictive models that would indicate if you do this, if you do A instead of B, your odds of being happy and fulfilled in life will go up or go down? And this got me on a track that was very different from the kinds of books I've written in the past, where I began to look at the scientific research that's been done on the fundamental components of human happiness, the things that people choose to do that raise their happiness or lower their happiness. And it turns out we have a lot of data on this. It just hasn't been put all together in a single location where you could say, hey, if I move to a place that has constant noise, my happiness will go down because human beings never fully adapt to loud noise. And if I move to a neighborhood that has fewer billboards, I have a higher probability of being happy. Same thing for neighborhoods that have front porches and wide sidewalks. There are certain things that elevate, that are associated with happier human beings and those that are not. So I guess my answer to your question is, if I were writing another book, and I said if I'm writing another book, because I haven't committed to doing this yet, but if I write another book, I think I'm going to tackle the one thing that we all share in common, and that is we would all like to be happy, but I'm not sure we know how to do it. And the how is the tricky part.
That is, to say the least, correct. I don't know that anyone would really disagree with that, and I don't think there is any silver bullet for happiness or fulfillment, moreover, in one's life.
Right.
There's just no easy answer to the question of what that is. And maybe in some evolutionary way yet to be defined, it's meant to be that way. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. Talking about pre-adaptation, the concept that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, that is something radical, obviously. It's not terribly difficult to understand, but it's nothing that I've heard somebody mention before, Rebecca. Why do you think that in order to deal with the short-term future, and when I say short-term future, it's what will be coming in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, why do you think the concept of pre-adaptation will be necessary, not for people who you could say might be most open to the idea, people who are in business, politics, whatever, but for the average Jack or Jane at home who's just trying to get by in their lives, probably living paycheck to paycheck, or not terribly interested in current events or philosophy or history, why do you think pre-adaptation is important for them?
Well, because it's too late to adapt. By the time you hear about a change, you're late to the table. So we're no longer a speedboat that can, turn to the left and turn to the right and make these quick shifts. We're more like an ocean liner that's got to start the change a mile ahead of time. You've got to start the turn now if you want to make it a mile down the road. So what pre-adaptation is it's just basically looking ahead, seeing what changes are coming, and then preparing for them now and making decisions now so that you can mitigate the danger. If you are a person who is in a job that has a repetitive component to it, your job is going to be replaced by robotics. This is 100% true. It's just a matter of time. So there is no reason for you to wait for the first robot to be installed in your company. you need to now be making a transition plan today. That's part of predaptation. If you know what's going to happen, there's no reason to wait for the negative consequence to hit you in the face. I would argue that your ability to survive that change is substantially lower if you wait until the change is upon you. In that way, we're no longer adapting, we're predapting. We're beginning to adapt to a change which has yet to occur. And that's a fundamental shift in our entire mentality. Whether it's arresting a terrorist before they've committed an actual crime, whether we evacuate whole cities before a hurricane or a flood has hit. We're getting better and better at knowing what is coming down the pike, and there's no reason to wait to make the adjustments.
Before Paul throws in his 2 cents, I I think that the future is not quite as humanistic as perhaps the past has been, and obviously humanism has its positives and downsides. I'm not glorifying it, but in the future, as you mentioned, many more things are going to be automated. And human beings, it seems to me, are just going to be less relevant to not only the economy, but to the functioning of society itself. And from my perspective, the only thing that one could really do then is like have less kids and essentially become acclimated to the idea that you're going to be interacting with machines far more than anybody that ever came before you. So that's going to influence, I guess, how one defines what it means to be well socialized. Rebecca, what do you think about my perspective there?
Well, I think you're looking for a place for humans in the future.
And on the whole, I suppose, what do you think the place for humans in the future would be, if that's even, I guess, answerable in a nutshell?
Well, I think there's a wonderful answer. I'm going to steal from my friend Edward O. Wilson at Harvard University. He was a mentor of mine and a hero of mine. And one day we were talking about, well, if aliens from outer space did pay us a visit, they wouldn't be interested in our mathematics. They wouldn't be interested in our physics, because as we travel further and further into outer space, our math and our physics seems to hold up, and so this would be common. They would already know that stuff. They wouldn't even be interested in our technology, because they would have surpassed our technology many light years ago. So what would interest them about the human species? Well, those things that would make us uniquely human. Our art, our music, right? Our writing, our thinking, our dance, paintings. I mean, these things are uniquely human and would not be replicated by other species in outer space. So perhaps all of the technology and the automation is really paving the way for humans to be what is unique about them, not what is replicated elsewhere. Presumably, automation exists everywhere in the universe. Presumably, the laws of mathematics and physics apply everywhere in the universe. But the things that make us uniquely human, we may be opening the door to elevate those things, because that's what will be left. Maybe it's a stripping away of the things that are not important.
Before Paul chimes in, and I'm sure he has quite a bit to chime in about, I'll just, I guess, ask one last question in the vein of my previous ones. A lot of people fear the future, I think, because they identify themselves on the basis of something that can be done by a machine, like somebody who is a machinist, for instance, at a plant somewhere. That person gets his or her identity, his or her sense of usefulness in life from pulling a lever or programming some sort of mechanism. And if you take that away from that person, then that individual is going to be quite lost, not just economically, but in terms of his or her own self-definition. And I think that as time rolls on, and as the inevitable automation of society comes into play, it's already coming into play. I mean, as it increases, I think there's just going to be many, many more people out there who wind up having mental breakdowns. Then their physical health will probably wind up declining as well because they won't be as physically active. And there'll just be a lot of leftover people from an era that was more, I guess, centered on human beings. And that's not, I mean, from my perspective, it's a very unfortunate event. But then if you look at the history of life in a really broad sense, what you see is that all organisms evolve. And when they evolve, certain things about them are no longer true because they're adapting to the future. And I think that humans, as technology continues to progress, they're going to have a lot of growing pains to go through. And to a certain extent, it might redefine what we consider to be a well-lived life or what it means to be humane, stuff like that. And that's really it's too complicated to get into, I guess, on a more intricate level.
Well, our history would contradict that theory. And here's the reason why. You know, in the 1960s and 70s, many sociologists started writing about the leisure society. They thought that automation, factory automation, everybody owning an automobile, you don't go to the river to wash your clothes anymore. You have a washing machine, you have a dishwasher. You had all this automation that was heading us in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so they said, hey, pretty soon humans are going to have so much leisure time, they won't know what to do with themselves. And yet the amount of leisure time that human beings have today has never been less. With all of this automation and with all of this technology, we have less time to loaf around and do nothing than at any other time in human history. So there's something not equating with this idea of there'll be nothing for humans to do. Because in fact, history has demonstrated it's the exact opposite. We're too busy and we have no free time.
Paul?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that last idea. I think that what Joseph has suggested is almost a kind of medieval idea of vocation, that a person is sort of tied to a particular labor by which he will define himself, usually with she too, because the woman would stay at home and raise children, have to look after the farm. But I think there has been a change that has been in the works for quite a while now, in which people just keep changing jobs and retooling themselves. And it's not that they're, I think, as Rebecca says, it's not that they're sort of dying of boredom. They have lots and lots of things to do. They're just not, they just do not identify themselves with a single vocation or a single form of labor, you know, as they did up until maybe, you know, until maybe just a few generations ago. I'm thinking even in the case of my late father-in-law, who was a physician,
you won't have a single career.
A European physician who identified himself as a doctor. I mean, that is what he defined himself as. Now I know people who are in medicine, and they go into all kinds of business, sell medical equipment. My son is both a physician and an attorney, and he practices both, and he goes from one thing to the other. So it's not that people, I think, are without, one might say, vocational identity. They're just far more flexible in what they do than was the case in the past. I'm not making a moral judgment. I can see much value in traditional social identification with, you know, a particular labor or vocation. But I think all of that has changed by now, I think, as Rebecca's indicated.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think this idea that you identify with a single career is, it's over. No one's going to have one career in their life from here on out. In fact, Aubrey Dubray, who's a genetic mathematician from Cambridge University has said that the first person to live to be 1,000 years old is already walking the planet. So this idea that you're going to have one career for 1,000 years, can you imagine the number of social and technological and scientific and methodological changes that are going to occur over 1,000-year lifespan? I mean, this idea that you're going to, you are what you do, is just, there's going to be a separation between what you do and who you are, because you'll have many, many jobs over the course of your life. And you have to be adaptable because, Charles Darwin said this over 200 years ago. He said the most important criteria for survival is adaptability. It's not expertise, and it won't be wealth.
I think that adaptation is something that most humans, I won't say all, I think it's a personality thing really on an individual level, but I think most people are very resistant toward it in one form or another, just because it involves the hardship of learning something new and then going along with essentially the new programming of your life. And that's very understandable to me on a humanistic level. But, at the end of the day, I guess the course of existence doesn't really care about what's humanistic or what isn't. We're only one species, really. And I think a lot of people do tend to forget that. They have maybe too intensely a human-centric view of the world and what it means to be alive. And I'm not saying we should have a human-centric view because we're human beings, but as time goes on and technology becomes ever more developed and it has more of a role in the operation of life itself, I think that humans are going to have to learn that they're not as important as they once thought they were. And that would really be just putting what might be described as the natural order of things into perspective.
Well, I agree with that. But don't you think that the real barrier to being flexible and malleable, adaptable, don't you think the real barrier is fear? That people are fear of failure, fear of embarrassment. People are fearful of change, and they're fearful about the future because of that. They feel the future's unknown, and yet, out of all the species, we know more about the future than any other species. My dog doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I have a pretty good idea. It may or may not materialize. Something could, happen tomorrow that's unexpected. But, for the most part, I have a pretty good idea that all things considered, I'll get up, I'll brush my teeth, I'll take a shower, I'm going to go to work, I'm going to get some lunch. I have a pretty good idea. And that's a lot more than other species walking the planet. So when you net all this out and you look at the long climb over millions of years that humans made to get to the top of the living pyramid, I'm on the side of optimism. I'm on the side of that machines aren't going to take over and we're not going to have any role and we're going to get fat and sloppy and kill ourselves with nuclear weapons. I don't really take that position. My position is that it'll be a new era of humanity, and the things which make us truly unique will have an opportunity to proliferate, and we will shake the chains of being a money-driven, power-driven society, because machines will be more capable of making money, and machines will be more powerful than human beings. And so, maybe we could shake the chains of being so commerce driven and begin to focus on other things that make us uniquely human. I think it'll be a wonderful opportunity for humankind to evolve.
Paul?
Yeah, no, I think that automation is something that has been occurring for a very, very long time. I mean, it's been going on for centuries. It's just going on at a more accelerated pace right now. and yet human beings have always, found employment. They sort of integrated themselves with machines. And I'm not sure that this process is going to come to an end next year, or the year after that, or people in a kind of Luddite fashion will start smashing machines because they're all out of work. But it seems that human beings do adjust themselves. I think Rebecca made an observation that people are fearful of change, yet people do accept some change as, just as part of the order of things. Like, I noticed that my children are able to adapt themselves to constantly changing jobs and job workplaces in a way that I could, that I would have done with far less comfort. It's simply, you stay in a job for a year or 2 years, then you look for a new job. Whereas people of my parents' generation stayed in the same job for 40 years until they died, or were given a gold watch or something like that. So that whether they think about this or not, people have become more mobile, and people are more willing to retool themselves than they were in the past. I mean, this is simply part of the way things have changed, and whether people are fearful or not of those changes, they just seem to accept them.
That's right. And what other choice do we have? I mean, you can try to resist social change, technological and scientific change, but it's going to happen. So why not capitalize on it by getting out ahead of the game? I wrote an article that I put up on my webpage, which is RebeccaCosta.com. And the title of the article is "Please Don't Ask Me This Question." And in it, I describe to people the fact that change is neither good nor bad. It just is. And so, you're either preparing for it, getting ready for it, getting out ahead of it, or you're waiting to become a victim of it, and you're trying to race to catch up, or some other negative outcome. I think the choice is clear. You want to get out ahead of change. You certainly don't want to be trailing, because you will be victimized by whatever that change is. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, you have this wonderful opportunity to say, well, what's coming down the pike? What's going to come and affect my life, right, in the next year, in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years? This is something that retirees do quite a bit. After the age of 60, they really start thinking about, well, what's going to happen in the next year, 2, 3, and 5? And younger people are starting to do more and more long-term thinking. And I think climate change has had a lot to do with that. That people are looking 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, at what kind of a world they'll be living in. And that in and of itself is a huge change in young people. When I was young, I didn't even think about next week. And so my hat is off that a much younger generation now, even in grammar school, is concerned about climate change 10 and 20 years out. That's fantastic.
This will be the second to last question. And it's directed at Rebecca and then Paul, of course, to share his views. I'm sure you're familiar, Rebecca, with the by now old Don Henley song, "The Heart of the Matter." And one of its lyrics goes, "The more I know, the less I understand." In coming to learn as much as you have about the future, do you believe that this idea that Henley vocalized, do you think that's true, at least in the context of futurism?
Yes, I believe that the more we know, the less we understand. So most of the scientists I know tend to be very humble people. We have many more questions, and we live with a lot of ambivalence and uncertainty. But as artificial intelligence gets more and more powerful, we're able to see things that would have taken millions of years for the brains that we currently have to have figured out. It's so wonderful to have access to these machines. And it's so wonderful to be learning at the pace that we're learning. If you think about the scientific breakthroughs, the number of patents filed, the number of breakthroughs that we hear about, day in and day out over the internet, it's accelerated at such an astronomical rate. And that is all good for humanity. It's from life-saving medicines to, new, safer children's toys and vehicles. I mean, we're becoming a safer and better society over time, except for those lingering Paleolithic emotions that sort of get us in trouble every now and then. But I do agree with those words. The more we learn, the less we know. And but hopefully now, with artificial intelligence and machine learning, we will know more at a faster rate, and we can build a better society with what we learn.
Paul?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Rebecca, would you be disappointed or surprised if the future turns out differently from the way she has predicted it?
Well, we're always choosing between our higher self and the instincts that we share with the lower animals. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but I will. I look at the potential election next year of one of the most powerful nations on the earth, the United States. And, I keep hoping for a benevolent leader to emerge, one who is conscious of the 3.5 million year history of humanity and our place on this planet, and who can speak to and inspire and motivate people to do the right things in life, and that are sustainable and will allow us to rise to a higher calling. I think we have a higher calling as the human race, and I would just like to see us rise to that. And if you ask me, well, what doesn't turn out, and then would you be disappointed? My disappointment is in leadership right now. I don't see anybody speaking to the big picture. I see that our leaders are looking at little tiny things that don't add up to the big picture, and so I would be really disappointed if we don't get leadership at some point that speaks to and raises everyone's line of sight.
Mm-hmm.
For the last question, I believe that the past is often a very good predictor of what will happen in the future. Obviously not exactly so. I mean, if it were exactly so, we'd all still be cavemen and women doing who knows what with rocks and spears and all this fun stuff. But it seems that when it comes to nature, and certainly human nature, history is a series of cycles that they repeat themselves. They just take on different attributes in their repetition. I don't necessarily know if anything will fundamentally change about humanity. I think that to a large extent we are what we've always been. And what will become is really just another version of what we presently are. So that kind of takes some of the romance or interest or intrigue out of the human species, humanism, whatever you want to call it. But to me, that just seems to be the way it is. Rebecca, then Paul, well, what are your perspectives on that?
Well, I think we could be so much more. That's my answer. We could be so much more. Instead we're being driven by the instincts we share with lower animals. But we have the capability to postpone gratification, to make sacrifice, to do things that other creatures on the planet don't have the capability to do. And it seems to me we should rise to be what we're in a very unnatural condition. Most creatures will leverage the hell out of their biological assets. Most creatures, if they had a prefrontal cortex, would be leveraging the heck out of it. We may be the first species to have developed an asset we choose to ignore and rely on prehistoric instincts. This is a really weird condition, to see this wonderful asset and decide, nah, I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to duke it out like a caveman.
Human beings definitely are weird. I think that goes without saying.
It goes against the laws of nature. Animals use their strongest asset. That's how they survive. We humans, for some reason, we're choosing not to. We're choosing not to use what we have.
Mm-hmm.
The reasons for that, I think, are too numerous to get into here, but there's no question that one of the most common events in human history, it's people squandering what good opportunities they have. And unfortunately, I don't see an end to that coming anytime soon. People often sell themselves too far short, or they ignore a very glaring opportunity that presents itself. And sometimes I guess it might be done subconsciously. In other cases, people do it with full knowledge of their action, but they prefer what they're used to, the kind of comfort that a humdrum life brings them. Mm-hmm. And that's just the way it is. And it's unfortunate that it is that way. But I've seen that happen too many times, both in my own life and in looking at history to get into here. Paul?
After hearing Rebecca's remark, I couldn't help thinking of Max von Sydow in one, I think, Hannah's Sisters by Woody Allen, in which Max von Sydow plays a deeply cynical person, and he says, "I just watched a film of a Nazi concentration camp," and what I thought of is, how rarely something like that happens. Given what human nature is, I would expect that to happen even more frequently. There's a kind of cynicism there, but I think when it comes to human nature, my sights are perhaps placed somewhat lower than those of Rebecca, and sort of given what human beings are, I think they perhaps behave better than one might expect. One of the points, though, that she raises that I think is a problem is leadership. I think she's quite right. And if you look at early American presidents, they're a hell of a lot better than the people that we've been seeing recently. And I've been saying actually through most of my lifetime. And I think we're dealing with the kind of electoral process and in a form of democracy in which it is very hard for really serious, principled people to rise to the top and to lead the country. I don't know what the answer is, but I think there really has been a fall off in the quality of leadership. Even when I go back to the period of Eisenhower or somebody like that, the presidents we've been seeing are not of the same quality as Truman or Roosevelt or Eisenhower or people of that era. And I say this as an historian. I think there has been a decline in leadership, and we don't have to go back to George Washington, but we can set our standards perhaps more close to our own time. I don't know what the answer is, and I think these problems are more likely to get worse before they become if they ever do get any better.
I agree. The really smart people that I admire in this world would never think of entering politics. And that's such a huge problem because if we're, as a society, if we're going to get better, we have to have the best of us, the best human beings that we can create. We've got to have a system that elevates those people to the very top. And we don't have that system anymore, but we can make it. That's the wonderful thing is we could make, we're a free society that could really make that system and say, who is the best human being among us, and how can we push them to the very top of leadership? And I think that's what we really ought to be looking at. The smartest, the most moral, the most insightful, the best judgment. Who is that person? And I don't think anyone would argue that those people don't want to go into leadership.
That's correct. They do not want to even get into the process.
They don't want anything to do with it, and that is hugely problematic, because we can't settle in this current state of world affairs. We cannot settle for less than the best of us.
I'll just throw out my, opinion here. It's not so much of a question as it is my observation. Lately, over the past maybe decade and a half, maybe just one decade, depending on how you look at it, but there has been the glorification of mediocrity to a large extent, not just in America. I think about a year and a half ago, there was big pressure placed on the British Army to change their logo, change their motto, which is "Be the Best." And they wanted to make it something more egalitarian. I don't know how you could be in any branch of any country's armed forces and not try to be the best. If you're just going to try to be average, you're probably going to wind up being killed or getting someone else killed because of your incompetence. So there definitely is, on a cultural level, the glorification of being not the best. It's the mindset of everybody getting a trophy, or a teacher using purple as opposed to red ink to highlight one of his or her students' failures on an exam or an essay of some kind. And that ethic is definitely unnatural, and it's going to cause a lot of problems, especially when people realize that trying not to be the best is not going to lead to the best outcome for them. It seems that they want to have positive outcomes by not trying to strive to be as productive as possible, and that to me is totally insane. But it is quite popular among many today. Very unfortunate. Needless to say, I agree with everything Rebecca just mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's preposterous to shoot for average and being, mediocre. I think that's ridiculous, and I think that at this current moment in time, we should be asking ourselves who is the best our species can produce. Who are they? And why are they not reflected in our leadership? What has broken down to the point where the best among us don't want to participate? I am worried about it. You asked me about the future. I'm not worried really about man and machines, because there will be, if history does repeat itself, there'll be more for us to do than less. There always has been. It'll just be different work. It won't be the kind of repetitive work we've done in the past. But I'm more worried about our future from the standpoint of society and how we relate to each other, and how we treat the very environment on which our ability to survive depends. We're not very good at the things that affect us species-wise. We're not good at nuclear disarmament. We're not good at climate change. We're not good at those things where we all have to get it together. We don't seem to be able to do that. In fact, I was on a program the other day where they were asking me about the tariffs, and I said, the tariffs are the same problem as climate change and nuclear disarmament. And they said, what are you talking about? And I realized I sounded like a crazy person. And I said, well, I'm not. I said, the only tariff that's fair is all countries drop all tariffs. Nothing is taxed going in and out of any country. Why should we have any tariffs? With the internet, we're trading all over the world anyways. So there's no reason for any tariffs. And I said, so everybody drops tariffs. We're all good. Now it's an even playing field. and everybody can import and export, and the best products rise to the top on a global basis. End of story. I said, but it'll never happen because we can't get it together on climate change, because everybody would have to cooperate. And same thing on nuclear disarmament. Everybody has to get rid of their nuclear weapons on the same hour of the same day of the same minute. And we don't trust the other guy to do it, so it'll never happen. So this is the problem, Paleolithic emotions.
Thank you for tuning in, everyone. See you next time.